Hi, everybody. I'm Dave Darrington, manager for Gainsight Success for Admins program. In this module, we're introducing the rules engine. So this session is meant to be your first introduction to the rules engine. Generally, we'll refer throughout Admin 101 to the rules engine. So this is meant to help familiarize you early on with rules engine fundamentals. We'll return in later sessions and later modules to give you a deeper dive and a deeper discussion of this content. By the end of this module, we expect that you will understand what the rules engine is, and it does. You'll be able to create a basic rule with the rules engine, and we'll explain the different components that make up the rules engine API. We'd like to start off by introducing what is the rules engine. So at a high level, rules engine is a fundamental or key component to Gainsight. You will use the rules engine to architect business rules that will trigger CTAs. They may update scorecard measures. They might fire off an email, and it can do many more things than that. So that's just the tip of the iceberg. Going a little bit further, the rules engine behind the scenes uses a query language, which you at this point don't have to be familiar with, to search your data for specific information. In Salesforce, you might be familiar with the term SOQL or structured object query language. MDA, which we'll talk about in a later session, which is our own database, we mainly use SQL. So depending on what you're utilizing at the time, the rules engine will take care of things behind the scenes correctly. In most of our processing, after your rules engine, your query pulls data, a lot of things are done externally within our MDA, so it doesn't count against you in Salesforce. Now with the rules engine, Gainsight now has capabilities to read any Salesforce.com integrated data, any objects that are created, standard or custom, provided you have access to them, and also to Gainsight's external MDA if you're storing information in that repository. So definitely some good things. Again, we will speak to the MDA in upcoming sessions, so this is our own database and we'll talk about it later. Now at this point, what I'd like to do is break off and demonstrate the rules engine interface from a higher level. Now within Gainsight, to access the rules engine, you would commonly go to the Administration tab on your toolbar. You click that, and then you will find that we're within the Administration console. Now what I'm going to do is show you a few separate things and generally kind of navigate at a high level first, and then we'll break them down one by one to talk about each functional aspect of the rules engine itself. So to get into the rules engine, I would click from the administration page, the rules tab. When I do that, you'll be presented with the rules engine screen. Sometimes it takes a moment to set up. So what you're looking at now is the rules engine page. You could obviously see that by looking at the rules engine tab here and seeing that I have quite a few rules that are listed on the left-hand side of the screen. Now going from the top, I did want to show we have active rules, so I can toggle these on and off. I could look at rules that are currently inactive. I'll tell you more about what all this is for later. I can filter. So for example, I may be wanting to look for a success plan, and filtering happens on the fly in browser, so it really does filter down content very well. You can actually click on this little magnifying glass and do some specific filtering. For instance, if I wanted to do created by, last modified by, or source object, that's very handy and useful. And then moving over to the right-hand side of the screen, we have three more buttons on the top menu bar of the rules engine. I have my default list view, which you see here. I have a timeline view, which gives me a timeline of execution of rules as they happen, very useful. And then, of course, I have my plus rule or add new rule, which if I would click that, it would start to allow me to create a new rule. Now I want to go a little bit further. That is the high level view. Now I'm moving down the screen and looking at clicking on a rule in specific. Now note as I hover over, on the left-hand side, you can see some icons are appearing. Of these icons, we have the clone, and typically you can hover over them, you'll see context. I have edit. I have delete. I can toggle whether this is active or inactive, on or off. And then if I choose to, I can run a rule immediately. Now, were I to click on this rule, a panel or pane opens up on the right-hand side of the screen with much more information, and now it's sticky. So I have, again, a clone, edit, and delete on this screen. The run now is obviously gone. And now I'm seeing a lot more information, which I'll go into later. But it's very important to know that this is where we are as we're navigating through. So now let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of a given rule. On this slide, you see kind of a timeline or a visual representation of what you might see on the Rules Engine top menu bar that I'll reinforce in a moment. So progressing from the left to the right, this is a very top level view of what we're going to do as we're creating and maintaining rules. So going from left to right, obviously editing a rule is where you name and describe your rule. Set up a rule, this is where you start to select from an object, meaning it might be a Salesforce object or it might be matrix data object. For example, it might be looking at tasks, it might be looking at calls to action. And you can then describe filters to that setup so that you're looking at only a subset of information that you want to gather. When you have the setup of the rule completed, you'll move into taking actions. So setting up an action means I might have multiple actions within that. And generally, this is where you might create a call to action, or you might send an email or update a scorecard. Again, we'll show you this in more detail in a moment. You could also implement criteria so that you could further filter down or action upon only specific data that you're working with. And then finally, schedule, which is quite obvious typically. You will schedule to run your rules in a certain order, at a certain time, in a certain day, or every day. And also, I will point out as we see visuals of this, you can schedule rules to run historically. So if you create a new rule and now want to apply that over a period of time, you can go back in time to a specific date. So that's the high level of this. Now we're back in the Gainsight interface, and we are tasked with creating a new rule. I'd like you to walk through this from a top level so you understand the sweep of start to finish of creating a rule from a very basic level. So to create a new rule, I'm just going to click the plus rule button up here in the top right. I'm presented with the create and edit rule page. It also says new rule here. So on the screen, you can specify your type. I'm going to default to custom, which you should always do at this point. Then I'm going to create a new rule. So I'm going to call this ZZZ admin 101 test. Okay, very clear in this that this is just a test rule. Now, in this case, it's worthy to note you have a lot of control over your naming conventions. We always advocate for coming up with something that makes sense. So we've defined our rule type, we've defined a name, we've defined a description. If you're actively testing something, it's always worthy to mention that you might want to have a naming convention that makes a rule appear at the bottom of the list. So if you're in an environment with multiple admins, everybody will know very clearly that a rule is being created and tested and is not to be used. So that's just good guidance there. So now I'm going to click Next, and I'm actually going to start to build my rule. I like to proceed from this by thinking about my source object or objects first. And that material is over here in the left-hand bar. In this segment, this is typically where you select your source object. And you can see if I click the drop-down button here, I get a search menu. And I also have a full list of all of the different source objects that I can have access to. There are two different things here. One is my native data, and that is Salesforce data, so that's stored in SFDC objects, or matrix data. And matrix data comes from our MDA and is a little bit different database format. I'm going to leave it at native data right now, and I'm going to go ahead and select an object to work with. So what I often like to do is click the down arrow and maybe I'll work with call to action. So CTA type. I'm creating, in this case, just a rule that allows me to look at all the attributes associated with a call to action and then work with them accordingly. So that is the setup part. One note I also like to make in this segment is objects must have an account lookup, and you will need read permission for objects or fields that you want to work with. Something very interesting, in this case, is not a good example of this. So let's select another example. Let's select a contact object. Okay, now for most objects that have a lookup to the account, you can see now I have three objects actually to work with. I have my contact object, which is the one that I care about right now. I have the account object because I have a lookup to the account from an account ID. And I have customer info, and customer info will talk throughout these sessions. Customer info is more or less our working memory of all of the customers in Gainsight that we are working with actively. So this allows us a lot of power. I can pick anything from these things and work with them. So now what we're going to do is start building out our rule. So first off, let's go select from our count field, or count object. I always start by selecting the account ID. And I select this off of the account object. So generally good practice. It allows always to map back to what that account ID is. That account ID is a really pivotal or quintessential field within Salesforce. So I pulled that over. And now let's pull in a few different fields. In this case, so I've got account ID. I'll pull in name. So I want to know what account I'm working with. Let's pull in a name. So from our contact, maybe I'd like to know full name of a person, right? So this is called the show. This is the fields that I want to show up on a report or in some kind of field or dashboard, have you. But that's what I am showing at every different time. Always good practice is as you are building a rule, you would preview. So down below, front and center in the bottom, if I click preview results, Gainsight will go and it will fetch just a sampling. And these are in no apparent order what I'm looking for. So now you can see I have the account ID, I have the account name, and I have full name. And just a caveat within Admin 101, I'm working in a demo org, so none of these are real customers with, well, there may be real customer names, but they're fake information. So that's preview. Now let's say I want to filter upon that. In this case, we have box. So maybe I'd want to filter out on the account name. To do that, I could select the account name, and then I can use a logic operator here. In this case, I just want to say I want to see box only. So now when I do a quick preview, I'll see I'm restricted just to box. Conversely, I could select the checkbox here, which okay, that does null. So if I'm looking for anything that there is no name, that might be a good data cleanup operation. But I could also say the inverse of that or is not equal to box. And so I have a lot of power over some basic logic. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of that because I don't really want to filter that out. However, if I have multiple filters, then I can start doing some advanced logic. And that is usually I could do A and B or A or B and make a little bit more precise queries. So let's pull this out. That's my filter. So now we've demonstrated what show and what filters both do. And let's go on to the next step. Although one thing I would like to mention is a lot of people ask me, what is applied to Gainsight customers only? And why is that checked by default? Specifically, what this means is we're only actioning upon contacts that are within the customer info object. So that may not be a one-to-one mapping between an account and what's in customer info. For example, I might be very active and have a sales team that's going out and developing opportunities. And as such, as I develop an opportunity, there would be a new account name associated with that. But perhaps that account is not onboarded yet and has not purchased our software. They're just an opportunity. That's why you may not see, and chances are will not see, an exact one-to-one mapping between what's in your account object and what's in your customer info object. So that's worthy to mention. There are some times, and this is for later material, where you would want to check that off. One other thing I also talked about was how advanced logic works, and also nulls, and that null checkbox in the filter field. And finally, that advanced logic works with both and or, and you cannot filter on really long text. So let's go to the next step. If I click next, I will now be in the setup action step. Something I'll draw your attention to again is that at the top bar of the Rules Engine interface, Rules Engine, if I were to click that, that would take me back to the main page. But I have Edit, or Edit and Create, Setup, Action, and Schedule. Really good to look and understand that this is not necessarily a linear flow, but it is designed to give you that impression that if you're going to create a new rule, you can work through there. I can click on any one of these provided that I have a rule set up and the actions and schedules are already set. So now we are within the setup action segment. And on the screen, we start to define what actions you're going to perform. So we designed the data model or the snippet of information that we are working with. And now we're taking action upon that bit of data that we've now pulled aside and we can work upon. So we can take multiple forms with this. For example, let me go ahead and click the plus action because I have no actions at all. If I select plus action, now I see that my interface is starting to fill out a little bit. And I have a action type, and the number here indicates the number of the action type that I'm actually working with. You can have up to 20 of them, but at some point they become unwieldy and sometimes hard to manage. So some of the actions that you can do, for instance, we'll just take a look through here. I can do updates and additions to specific Gainsight objects or Salesforce objects. So you can see here, I have usage data. So that's an object within Gainsight, it's in the Salesforce stack. I have load to customers, I have load to milestone, I have load to features. Further down the line, I have load to salesforce.com or load to SFD object. I could even load to a MDA subject area, which is very similar to an object. So those are kind of loading to or updating an object directly. Similarly, I can work on process-driven things like I may want to create a call to action, a CTA that will appear for a customer success manager. I mentioned load to milestone that would put a milestone in my usage data, or I could set a score. So as we'll learn later on, if we're working with scorecards, there are both objective and subjective types of scores. In this case, we would be objectively or procedurally making an update to a score. So in this case, let's just create base call to action. You'll see an interface here, and I don't pay too much attention in this stage of the game as we were demoing this out what I'm doing because it's not particularly important. I'm just going to click the buttons and make a few things. In this case, I'm selecting a high priority new call to action. Maybe I'll say I've lost a champion at a site. I'll indicate a type. That's a risk. If I lost a champion, I want to call the company that I'm working with and make sure that their project is still on timeline and working great. I might have a playbook that I want to work with. Playbooks, again, will be defined later on in the sessions. I've lost an exec sponsor here. By default, I can set this to somebody that I want here. Okay, we'll leave that off. I'm going to default this to me. And then I can fill in information below. So I can even do tokens. I could say test, whatever. So I wasn't getting too deep in the weeds in this, and we'll talk about this much more at a later time. Also important to note criteria down below. If I click the criteria button, now I have more information. We could use criteria to take different actions on this subset of customers that we've returned in from our first step where we're setting up our rule. Now in this case, it's worthy to note if we have multiple criteria to work with, we can only select and. So maybe in this type, I want to do, what do I want to look where account IDs are equal to box? Then I can work with that. So very good. I can save this then, and now everything is saved in memory. If you don't save this, then if you would switch off to any of the other tabs, you would lose your place, you lose your information. Also important to note before we move forward is that loading to any Salesforce objects is a little bit more advanced, and it may require specific permissions to be set. If you as an admin are not a Salesforce admin, if you don't have access to certain things, then you want to coordinate with your Salesforce administrator if you're working with roles that hit any of these fields. Scheduling has its own interface. You can see that I could schedule daily, monthly, weekly, and yearly, and specify all the requirements on this of how it will be run, and also run for historical periods. Okay, now let's go through a few exercises. And some of the things that I'd showed you if you'd worked along with me on this module, that section I was more focused on presenting to you the high level, getting the feel of the interface. So you can see on my screen, I'll walk through this first. It's going to be very simple. We're just going to make a welcome for a new customer. We'll start off actually getting into the rules interface. We'll go through all the steps where we fill in, edit the rule, add a description. We'll set up what we want to look at, and then we will complete the rule by testing it. We're going to set up an action, and we're going to run it to see what actually happens.